Okay, so God's love and great literature. Well, I believe in defining terms. So we're going to define love, and specifically what is God's love as opposed to the other love. So, one of the most famous questions in all of history was the question quid est veritas, asked, of course, by Pontius Pilate. And that's not a difficult one to answer because it's been given by the person to whom it was answered, who said elsewhere in the Gospel, I am the way, the truth, and the life. But what's a bit more difficult is what is love, because throughout the whole of human history there have been two definitions of love that are diametrically and diabolically, if you like, opposed to each other. There is God's love, which is basically, through God's grace, is the rational choosing of the path of self-sacrifice, freely choosing to lay down your life for the beloved, even if the beloved is your enemy. So it's a rational choice and has nothing to do with feeling. Obviously, you're going to have different feelings towards your wife or husband than you have towards your enemy, at least hopefully most of the time. And again, your feelings towards your children or your siblings or your parents, your friends and your enemies. The feelings are going to vary and they're going to change. And they're going to be different, radically different. But philosophically speaking, that's accidental. What's essential to love is the rational choice to freely choose to lay down your life for the beloved. So for Christianity, love actually is something profoundly rational. It's using your freedom to give yourself to another. But against that's the other love, which is about feeling. It is about emotion. Usually the way it's normally appeared in great literature in terms of eros, erotic love. So love either it involves laying down your life for the beloved or laying down the life of the beloved for yourself. In other words, love as a gratification of desire. So we see this played out in great literature. We see the other love, if you like, in great lovers from pre-Christian times, such as Paris and Helen. But what you find in great literature is the disastrous, destructive consequences of recklessly following one's passions at the expense of one's reason, as Shakespeare says, when reason panders will. Right? When you put your reason to the service of your desire, disaster is the consequence. So Paris and Helen launches 1,000 ships, right? We have the Trojan War as a consequence. At the beginning of the Iliad, it's not actually the disordered passions of Paris and Helen that the epic's about. The Trojan War's about that, but the epic's about the disordered love of Agamemnon for a slave girl, a war prize, that's taken from him against his will, and he insists on that case he's going to take someone else's war prize, Achilles'. So it's this disordered attitude towards love that causes the particular epic in the Iliad. Against that, look at Odysseus and Penelope. So here we have in Penelope someone who remains faithful to her husband, even though he's been gone by the end of the epic for almost 20 years. She's besieged by unwanted suitors. So there's a parallel here, right? Troy is besieged in the Iliad, Penelope is besieged in the Odyssey, and goes to great lengths to not have to succumb to the will of the suitors, to delay them, to procrastinate, to wait. And the burial shroud she weaves, and then in the evening unweaves. It's a burial shroud for Laertes, but metaphorically it's a burial shroud for Odysseus. Until she knows he's dead, she cannot commit herself to anybody else. So during the day when she's worried and assuming he surely must be dead now, otherwise he would have come back, she's weaving the burial shroud, and at night she doesn't know that he's dead and she unweaves it again. So this great, in Penelope we have the first iconic vision, if you like, of true love, self-sacrificial love. Now, is Odysseus worthy of her? No. But the other aspect of the Odyssey is Odysseus is growing in virtue and humility. Right? The curse comes upon him because he's not content to be nobody. He has to boast that he is somebody. And it's when he boasts that he is somebody that Polyphemus brings down the curse upon him, giving Odysseus' name and address, which quite conveniently Odysseus has just given to him. And the same with the Odysseus men, it's their arrogance. So Odysseus grows in humility, and when he comes home, does he come home leading his men back, glorious from battle, glorious from war? And he comes back at the behest of the gods, the will of the gods, as a beggar. So Odysseus has to learn humility to be worthy of the love of Penelope. Then we have an Antigone. So Antigone is not a love for a spouse, it's a love for a brother. And I say I'm not going to recount all the stories because either you know them already, in which case it would be tedious for you, or if you don't know them already, you'd have to sit here for 3 hours while I explain all the books. So Antigone, this is something timeless. Great literature is timeless. There are timeless lessons. They're ageless. So C.S. Lewis says that fashions are coming and going, but mostly going. So if something's up to date, it's a sure sign it's going to be out of date. But if something is still being read 2,500 years after it was written, it's because it's saying something that speaks to all generations. So in Antigone's case, you have a secular government which is denying religious liberty. The secular government says that if you fought for us in the war, you will have a noble, glorious state funeral and you'll be eulogized and a hero. If you fought for the other side in the war, you will not be buried at all. You'll be left there to rot for the birds of the field to devour you. And Antigone has to make a choice. Does she obey the law of the land, the secular law, or does she obey a higher law, the law of the gods, and give her brother the religious funeral, the religious rites of burial that his dignity as a human person demands? And Antigone chooses, as she says, I'm only going to be alive for a short period of time. I'm going to be in the afterlife with the gods for much longer than that. It's much more important for me to keep the gods happy than to keep the secular government happy. So she's a martyr for religious liberty who lays down her life for her gods and for her kin, a kinsman. We see that paralleled, of course, in other stories in history as well as in literature. The case of St. Thomas More is exactly that situation. The case of Cordelia in King Lear is that situation. Let's move on to the Aeneid. Aeneas has a divine mission to found Rome from the ashes of Troy, the resurrection of Troy. I could say much more about the context of that. It's not really part of the theme of the talk. But he gets distracted. He gets distracted by a beautiful woman. She also gets distracted because she has a mission for her own people to rebuild Carthage. She's in the midst of rebuilding Carthage. That's her responsibility to her people, to rebuild the city. But she gets distracted by a handsome man. And both of Aeneas and Dido fall passionately in love with each other, so that they neglect their responsibilities to their own people, their own family, and to God, or the gods in Aeneas' case. The relationship is destructive. It's against the will of God. And they are described as being prisoners of lust. So in St. Paul, we hear that basically succumbing to sin makes you addicted to it, right? A prisoner, a slave. That vice is not just vicious, it's addictive. They're prisoners of lust. They can think of nothing else except each other. And in the end, Aeneas basically has to have a message from the gods themselves, so basically slapping him around the face, saying, "What are you thinking?" And then, obedient to the will of God, he breaks off the relationship. Dido's love for him turns to hatred. She curses him, curses his people, and commits suicide. Then we have Paolo and Francesca, Dante's Divine Comedy. You know, and in our romantic age, they are great lovers. How do they possibly deserve hell? They loved each other so much. But what Dante shows us in this, when we go to the deeper elements of the Divine Comedy to illustrate it, is that they were aroused by reading erotic, romantic fiction together. She's a married woman. They read no more. They put the book down. And in hell, they are blown around for eternity by the winds of passion. They're together, they can never be separated, but nor can ever be settled. Now, try to see that in the context of the Divine Comedy as a whole. Dante begins the Divine Comedy in the dark wood of sin. He can't escape the dark wood of sin because he is addicted to sin itself. He's trapped by sin. He can't escape. And a part of the Divine Comedy, it's not the whole thing, is the purification of Dante's love for Beatrice. His love for Beatrice is impure. The purification. That's why, by the way, that Dante has great sympathy. Dante, the character in the story, has great sympathy for Paolo and Francesca, because Dante is still in hell. But the Dante who actually eventually loves Beatrice as Beatrice should be loved, chastely, would not behave the same way. So the final part in the Divine Comedy is when Dante forgets that Beatrice is there. And Beatrice, how does Beatrice respond? She smiles and then turns away from Dante towards the beatific vision, which is where Dante is looking. Romeo and Juliet, what great lovers they were. Again, that play is almost always taught from the romantic perspective that Romeo and Juliet's love is beautiful, and that it's those pesky adults that are the problem. What's quite interesting about Romeo and Juliet, so we've got to limit how much time we can talk about these things. We're going to cover the ground, the panorama. It's a whole history of Western civilization with relationship to God's love in 40 minutes. No, we're on track. We just covered about 1,300 years in about 15 minutes. But in the source poem for Romeo and Juliet, Romeo is 18 and Juliet 16. In Shakespeare's play, he makes Juliet 13. And Romeo's age is not given. But he's old enough to defeat the fearsome Tybalt, who everyone's scared of in a sword fight. He's old enough to banter cynically with Mercutio about love. He's not a kid. Let's say he's 18. Let's not make him older than that. Let's say he's 18. He's completely erotically besotted with Rosaline at the beginning of the play. We never see Rosaline. She's one of my favourite characters in the whole of Shakespeare, and we never see her. He pursues her. He tries to seduce her. He offers her money. for her to, saints seducing gold, to ope her lap. She refuses. She tells him that she has made a vow of chastity and perhaps has a religious vocation. I like to think that she didn't, and it's just a ploy to get rid of him. But either way, right? Either she's a chaste, holy woman who just wants to get rid of this stalker, or she's a feisty girl who says, what can I do to get rid of this man? Tell him I've got a vow of chastity, that might do it. And they were told between the two acts that Romeo loved and loved alike. Bewitched. So that's not a different love between the two. That's why he was taught Rosalind. That wasn't the real love. The real love was Juliet. No, but the actual prologue, the chorus, and the chorus as a voice is an impartial voice, a narrative voice. It's not a character with an angle and a personality and a motive. It's just a narrative voice telling us that he loved this woman, he loves this woman, and now he's bewitched by both. And when does he fall in madly in love is the right adjective. Adverb. Sorry. Correcting myself as I go. It's grading my own paper. That blew the A+, that's for sure. He falls in love with her before he even knows her name or has spoken a single word to her. So what does he love? Right? He loves her face and her figure, what she looks like. It might be love at first sight, but what sort of love is it? By the way, I was taught, 13-year-old, it wasn't unusual for people to get married at 13 in Shakespeare's time. Well, it's always good to do a little bit of research. I didn't have to do it because another scholar had done it already. Why not look at marriage certificates from the late 1590s, around the time Romeo and Juliet's been written? The average age of women to be married in Shakespeare's England was early to mid-20s. The average age for men to be married was mid to late 20s. Marriage under the age of 18 was very rare, under the age of 16 was almost unheard of. And when a marriage was contracted, usually by the parents, prior to that, the marriage was not consummated. In other words, they weren't married until they reached a suitable age, certainly not 13. It's generally assumed, because of things like nutrition and what we know about the physical sciences now, that if anything, children reached puberty and maturity later in Elizabethan times than they do today. So a 13-year-old would have seemed very, if anything, more of a child than a 13-year-old would seem today. An 18-year-old stalking a 13-year-old. Why are we calling it true love? Incidentally, how old do you think Shakespeare's daughter Susanna was when he was writing this play? 13. This is a play written by the father of a teenage girl. Romeo and Juliet's love ends disastrously because they are not following reason or virtue. Now, Antony and Cleopatra are old enough to know better. That's enough for them. Portia and Bassanio. The Merchant of Venice is the whole play is about God's love in the sense of self-sacrificial love. So there's two things happening. You have to use sort of visual images to understand what's happening in Merchant of Venice. First of all, it's happening on two levels. It's the level of Venice, the city of man, the city of sort of sordidness, avarice, sin, usury, vengeance, anger, hatred. And Belmont, the beautiful mountain where the heavenly Portia lives. And if basically the moral dynamic as regards individual characters, there are some that stay resolutely at ground zero in Venice throughout the whole of the play. There are some that are always in the heavenly realm of Belmont, i.e. Portia, and there are those who grow in virtue and ascend from one level to the other throughout the course of the play. And then horizontally, the plot line is like a piece of string with 3 knots tied in it, 3 focal points, each of which is a trial or a test, each of which is the passing the test is to show true love, self-sacrificial love. So in the test of the caskets, if you're choosing love for gold, or you're choosing love for silver, in other words, why are you choosing? You're choosing love to lay down the life of the beloved for the self. Whereas the third casket is a lead casket, a coffin. And in order to win the hand of the heavenly Portia, you can't lay down Portia for yourself. You have to lay down yourself for Portia. You have to die to yourself. You have to sacrifice yourself that you may earn the love. And then she gives him a ring and she says to him that this ring is a sign of our love, for better or worse, sickness or health, death do us part. And if she were to betray that ring, give that ring away, that's basically the act of treachery, the act of adultery, and she will have the right to judge him. But that's the third test, the test of the rings. But then we have the test of the trial. And again, this play is so often mistaught. I could say so much more about it. I don't have that much time. But there's a wonderful, the Ignatius Critical Edition of The Merchant of Venice, buy it. One of the reasons you should buy it is because there's an essay at the back by Daniel Lowenstein, who's a professor of law at the UCLA School of Law, who focuses his whole essay purely on the trial scene, showing what Portia's trying to do is to get Shylock off the hook. You can't kill someone because they owe you money. No law has ever permitted that. To demand a pound of flesh closest to the heart is to kill the victim. But Shylock can't be forced to relinquish that. He has to freely choose not vengeance but love, mercy, forgiveness. Not at free. He's going to get not only his price, he's offered 3 times the price. He refuses all that because of his vengeance. We have that wonderful talk about the quality of mercy in the midst of all this. How can we expect mercy if we don't show mercy? And Shylock is absolutely intent on having Antonio's life. And that's when she says, well, the word of the bond is such, you can have the pound of flesh, but if you spill any of his blood, then you will be guilty of his death. Now, the test of the trial, test of the rings, I mean. Of course, Portia manages to reason the ring away from Bassanio, disguised. Bassanio doesn't know it's Portia. It's the doctor of Rome, by the way, Balthasar, a wise man. I'll let that speak for itself. He gives the ring away to her. Now, she has every right now. Now, that's how faithful your love is. How long? You're going to love me till the day you die, lay down your life for me, the lead casket, everything else. And it's been a week. Right? You haven't managed to be faithful for a week. But, she doesn't say, well, to hell with you. You're clearly a miserable loser. Get out of here. Give me a divorce. First of all, she has great fun with him, right, at his expense. She finds it a means of amusement. Why? Because she practices what she preaches. She shows mercy. And again, in a true marriage, if you're expecting your spouse to be perfect all the time, the only thing that's going to be certain is you'll be disappointed. Very briefly, I will say this because it needs to be said. You have to know something about context to understand literature or history or relationships with our contemporaries so much. There were no Jews in England in Shakespeare's time. They'd been expelled 300 years earlier by Edward I. The only usurers, and usury had been condemned by the church and by the Greek philosophers, so it's always been condemned as being an immoral act. And there's another great essay in that Ignatian tradition about the history of moral philosophy with respect to usury. But Calvin broke ranks. Calvin said that usury was permissible. So the only moneylenders in Shakespeare's England were the Puritans. It was illegal for Shakespeare to talk about contemporary religion and politics on the stage. It was against the law. So if you want to talk about contemporary religion and politics, you have to use euphemisms and allegories. So Shakespeare's audience would have seen in Shylock a Puritan. So literally, he's a Jew. Allegorically, he's a Puritan. The Puritans not just hate the church, of course, they hate the theatre. When the Puritans come to power 50 years after this, they close down all the theatres, ban Easter, ban Christmas. Shakespeare's audience, there were no Puritans in Shakespeare's audience, right? But everybody in Shakespeare's audience did not like the Puritans. So when you're vilifying Shylock, Shakespeare's audience, what they're vilifying is the villain, it's the Puritan. It'd be similar to someone vilifying a Gestapo officer in a film made in 1950, just after the end of World War II. No one's going to complain. But if you don't have that context, you don't understand. And there's some controversy that you want to ask questions about. That's good, because I like to be feisty too, just like Rosaline. King Lear, Cordelia. At the beginning of the play, King Lear says, "Tell me how much you love me, and you will be rewarded materially with great power and land." Of course, Regan and Goneril, the two daughters who don't love him, tell him how much they love him and get the power and land. Cordelia, the one who does love him, chooses to love and be silent, because she's not going to try to outdo her sister's lies in flattery. So she chooses to be silent. She refuses. She's a recusant. And she suffers exile. Again, to Shakespeare's audience, this is the situation that the Catholics in Shakespeare's England, dissidents against the government, in exactly the same position as Antigone is in. That you have to take oaths, the oath of supremacy, that the king, or the queen in this case, no, it's the king again by King Lear, James I, that the king is the supreme head of the church. And if you refuse to take that oath, you are thrown in prison, or forced into exile, or fined heavily, or in some cases, martyred. Cordelia is in exactly the same position Antigone's in, but also exactly the same position as many Englishmen are in when Shakespeare's writing that play. So Cordelia is the one who shows true love, God's love. There's a wonderful scene at the end of the play. It's a reverse Pieta. So if you've been to St. Peter's in Rome, and you look at Michelangelo's wonderful Pieta with the Mother of God cradling her crucified son. The scene at the end of King Lear, it's the bereft father cradling his dead daughter. But the final thing he sees, he says, look. He has an image of the resurrected Cordelia. He dies delirious, but he dies deliriously happy. He's had a mystical vision of her resurrection. Now, if you have a worldly mind, then that's merely because he's mad. If you have a worldly mind, when St. Francis of Assisi strips all of his clothes off and walks off naked into the woods, it's because he's mad. Radical love, radical true love, laying down our life radically for the other, is madness in the eyes of the world. Regan and Goneril were the sensible ones. Say what he wants, get what you want. Then Shakespeare's final play, The Tempest, you have this relationship between Miranda and Ferdinand, and Prospero makes Ferdinand carry logs, symbolic of the cross. Is he willing to sacrifice for her? If I make it too easy, he won't realize the great gift he's getting with her. And then he finds them, discovers them in flagrante delicto, in flagrant delight. That normally means you find people in a compromising position sexually. He discovers them, having an intimate relationship, playing a game of chess. That's Shakespeare's sense of humour. You can't think of anything further away from the act of fornication than playing chess. And let's move on to the 20th century to finish off. Two great works of Tolkien, The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. So, one of the most famous lines in all of literature is the opening line of The Hobbit. Someone tell it to me, what is it? It's a chorus, there we go. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. But then the rest of that opening paragraph, it's not a slimy hole with worms, right? This is a hobbit hole. And what does a hobbit hole mean? It means comfort. A hobbit hole means comfort. The hobbit hole is Bilbo Baggins's comfort zone. He's surrounded by the creature comforts. He's a creature of comfort, addicted to the creature comforts. He's not interested in discomfort. There's a wonderful Catholic novelist called Maurice Baring, and there's a priest character in one of his novels says, the acceptance of suffering is the secret of life. When you understand that, you'll understand everything. Not suffering, but the acceptance of suffering. Well, if you refuse to leave your comfort zone and go on an adventure, which is an uncomfortable thing, right, it's because you are in need of an adventure. So Gandalf says, you should go out on that adventure. It will be very good for you. That's why you should go. It's very good for you if you survive. So Bilbo Baggins leaves his comfort zone and goes on an adventure. He learns to suffer. He learns to suffer for others. He learns to lay down his life self-sacrificially. He dies to himself. He's healed of the dragon sickness. If you think the dragon sickness, Smaug has the dragon sickness, dragons have dragon sickness, but we're all dragons. The dragon sickness is when you're possessed by your possessions. Smaug has so much treasure, he's squatting on, none of it's of any use to him. He's addicted to his possession of it. He can't even go out and enjoy himself because somebody might come in and steal something. He's a prisoner of his avarice. He's possessed by his possessions. Now go back to Bilbo Baggins in his hobbit hole. Smaug is a big dragon living under a mountain. Bilbo Baggins is a small hobbit living under a hill. It actually addresses Underhill. He's surrounded by his possessions. He won't leave because he's possessed by his possessions. He's squatting on his treasure, just less of it because there's less of him. The only difference between Bilbo Baggins at the beginning of the story and Smaug is a question of scale. So when Bilbo Baggins returns home, what's happening? His house is not being robbed, but it is sort of being robbed, yes, but that's not the term that's used. Sold. Why is it being sold? Because they think he's dead. Bilbo's return is a resurrection. And it's a real resurrection because the Bilbo who returns is more alive than the Bilbo that left. Why? Because he died. Bilbo Baggins had died to himself so that he could live. He comes back as a resurrected Bilbo Baggins, no longer suffering from the dragon sickness. Same sort of thing happens in Lord of the Rings. I won't say too much about it because we are running out of time here, and it's good commercial break for the books on Tolkien that you probably find at the back there. You want more details. But let's quick just the 3-minute version of what is I often give as a 45-minute talk. I like challenges. On what date is the Lord of the Ring is the ring destroyed? March 25th. Okay. March the 25th is the Feast of the Annunciation. Right? The Feast of the Annunciation is much more important than Christmas because life begins at conception, not at birth. God becomes man, the Word becomes flesh on March the 25th, not December the 25th. Which is why in the medieval times the New Year's Day was often given as March the 25th, which is also given in the Shire after the fall of the ring. But according to tradition, March the 25th is also the date of the crucifixion. Now, we don't celebrate a particular date for the crucifixion because Good Friday is a movable feast, right? The Triduum. But the historical event of Christ's crucifixion on the cross happened on a real day once in history. And according to tradition, that's March the 25th. So the date on which God becomes man and the date on which Christ dies on the cross for us is March the 25th. That's the date on which the ring is destroyed. On what date does Frodo Baggins and the Fellowship leave Rivendell? December the 25th. So Frodo Baggins' journey from Rivendell to Mount Doom, or Golgotha if you prefer, is the life of Jesus Christ from his birth to his death. Now, when you understand that, the ring can be seen as what it's destroyed on the same date as sin is destroyed. The power of sin. The power of the ring and the power of sin are destroyed on the same significant date. That means the ring is symbolic of sin itself. When you put the ring on, you excommunicate yourself from the good world that God made and you become invisible. You only become invisible to the good world that God made, however. You're more visible than ever to Satan. Sorry, Sauron if you prefer. Because you enter his dominion. The longer you keep the ring on, the more power he has over you. One of the most perfect depictions psychologically of a soul enslaved to the power of sin is Gollum. We should all be using a new verb, to Gollumize. If you keep doing that, you've got to Gollumize yourself. It's not a good idea. So that's the ring wearer, the act of sin. What about the ring bearer? What about the one who carries the burden of sin without sinning? The one who carries the burden of sin without sinning is the cross bearer, the one who lays down his life in love for others. So I could say much more, but I think you get the point. So I'm going to finish the talk to keep us on time here. So I think we'd like to have time for a few questions, Q&A, but we don't want to leave you too late. And of course, you need lots of time. You know, by the way, that during the third week of Easter, according to custom, anywhere near a book table, you don't have to practice the virtue of prudence or temperance. You don't know that tradition? I'm going to finish with a quote by J.R.R. Tolkien. That's a good way of finishing this talk. I want to know what true love is. It's here. Out of the darkness of my life, so much frustrated, I put before you the one great thing to love on earth, the blessed sacrament. There you will find romance, glory, honor, fidelity, and the true way of all your loves on earth. And more than that, death. By the divine paradox, that which ends life and demands the surrender of all, and yet by the taste or foretaste of which alone can what you seek in your earthly relationships, love, faithfulness, joy, be maintained, or take on that complexion of reality, of eternal endurance, which every man's heart desires. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Joseph. So we do have some time for questions, but not too much time. We do want to allow for a bit of lack of prudence and temperance at the end. So if you've got a question, raise your hand, and we've got a mic too, which should be good to use the mic so up the front to begin.
Joseph, maybe a comment and a question. I'm going to go for the double decker. Extrapolating from your analogy of Frodo bearing the ring being Christ bearing the cross, would that be reasonable, therefore, to say that Sam Gamgee is like Simon of Cyrene?
Very good. Great question. Was that your question? That sounded like a question.
Just a comment, just seeking clarification.
Oh, so you got a question to come. Let me comment on your comment that sounded like a question. The important thing here is that Tolkien did not write formal allegory, right? So if you look at something like, we'll give a couple of quick examples of formal allegory, right? In C.S. Lewis's The Pilgrim's Regress, that John, the everyman character, is imprisoned by a monster called the Spirit of the Age. And he's liberated from the Spirit of the Age by a beautiful woman in shining armour whose name is Reason. And Reason has two younger sisters, Theology and Philosophy, right? That's formal allegory. They are personified abstractions, okay? Tolkien doesn't use that. Nor does C.S. Lewis, but C.S. Lewis is less subtle. So Aslan, right, is a Christ figure at all times in all 7 stories. Tolkien is much more subtle. So Frodo Baggins literally is always and only a hobbit of the Shire. It's only in that one aspect of his role as the ring bearer, understood symbolically, does he become a Christ figure. Gandalf, in his death, resurrection and transfiguration, is also a Christ figure. Aragorn, as the return of the king who has the power to take the paths of the dead and release the dead from their curse, is a Christ figure. So Tolkien is much more subtle. So in that sense, can we see Samwise Gamgee as Simon of Cyrene? Yes. Can we see him as the loyal disciple of Christ in the broader sense, who follows Christ by taking up his own cross, right? And accepting the same, if you like, crucifixion in life in order to follow Christ? Yes. What's your question that might sound like a comment?
The question was if you could maybe comment on the nature of the love between Luthien and Beren from the Silmarillion in the context of the broader sort of scope of the presentation.
Yeah, so the story of Luthien and Beren is very much one of God's love in the way we've been discussing it, of self-sacrificial love. Both of them lay down their lives wholeheartedly and fully for the other, and the fact that Tolkien believed that their love was fully and truly that sort of Christian love is the fact that on his grave, his wife's grave, when she died, he actually put under her name Luthien, and then when he died, his children put under his name Beren, so that they are themselves Beren and Luthien. Their own love was a manifestation or reflection of the love of Beren and Luthien, which also comes back to Tolkien, that fairy stories hold up a mirror to man. They show us ourselves. Here we see how Tolkien and Lewis see themselves reflected in the characters Beren and Luthien.
I'll go Sophie and then you're next.
Sophie York. Thank you very much, Joe. That was very fascinating and interesting and witty as well. I heard that you were an adult convert to Catholicism. Are you happy to share how that came about, the circumstances?
I'll see on that.
Well, I tell you what, let me ask a question. A bookstore at the back there, do you have any copies of Race with the Devil? You don't? You only bought from Ignatius Press? Darn! I was going to offer you 10% on all sales. I wrote a book called Race with the Devil, My Journey from Racial Hatred to Rational Love. So I was received in the church when I was 28, but prior to that, from the age of 15 to the age of 26, I was a member of a white supremacist organisation in England. I published edited a magazine for which I was sent to prison twice for hate crimes, for publishing material like to incite racial hatred. Hated the Catholic Church. I was involved in the terrorist organisations in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, and knew the leadership of both the UDA and the UVF, and was a member of the anti-Catholic secret society, the Orange Order.
Apart from that, he was okay.
No, I made that up. No, that's all true. That's all true. So I was a long, long way from the Catholic Church, as you would imagine, and I tell it in my book, Race with the Devil, My Journey from Racial Hatred to Rational Love. I do give a talk on the topic, and I might be giving a talk on the topic somewhere. I just can't remember. Friday, where?
Belfield.
Friday, where?
St. Michael's Belfield.
St. Michael's Belfield, Friday night for the full unexpurgated version. I would just say very briefly that one of the major influences upon my conversion was G.K. Chesterton, discovering the writing of G.K. Chesterton. So my first published book as a Catholic was my biography of Chesterton, and I always say that was an act of thanksgiving to God for giving me Chesterton, but also an act of thanksgiving to Chesterton for giving me God.
I have a question regarding Tolkien and his theological education. To what degree was Tolkien theologically educated, and to what degree does the theological education help one understand what it was he was trying to do?
Well, that's great. A great question. Tolkien was a philologist, not a theologian. He was a professor at Oxford University for decades in the language department as a philologist, as a lover of language. His speciality was Old English. But he was also a lifelong practicing Catholic and an intelligent man who knew his faith. So he's a lay theologian, if you like, not an academic theologian. But if you actually, the more you read his work, the more you understand how profoundly he was steeped in orthodox, authentic Catholic theology. But he's not a trained theologian.
Yep, up the back.
You mentioned tonight the recusant themes in Shakespeare, and I've always wondered for a while, do you think that that was a theme in English literature at the time? Like, could we say that possibly someone like John Donne or George Herbert were also recusant or had, let's say, crypto-Catholic tendencies? Or is Shakespeare really the only example with enough evidence to say that?
Well, that's a great question again. I've written 3 books on Shakespeare. Do we have any of those? Do we have any books on Shakespeare back there? No? No, okay. Ask the right sort of questions. I've written 3 books on Shakespeare. The first book, The Quest for Shakespeare, gives the biographical and historical evidence for Shakespeare's Catholicism. The other 2 books give the textual evidence from the plays. And I've written... Anyway, I won't carry on. But ideally, I would like to write on every single one of the plays and the poems and the sonnets before I die, God willing. So Shakespeare, beyond any reasonable doubt, was a believing Catholic, probably a secretly practicing Catholic at a time when the Catholic Church was illegal. John Donne was born in a Catholic family. He's related distantly to Thomas More, but was the opposite to a recusant. He was an apostate. George Herbert was a practicing Anglican. Ben Jonson was a recusant for a while and actually spent time in prison for a play which got a bit too close to being an open satire of Queen Elizabeth's court. So Shakespeare's not alone, but certainly there's some Catholic stuff mentioned in both of those, so thank you, yeah. So to answer your question, that's probably the best I can do. But it's very difficult when you talk about Catholic themes in Shakespeare, if you haven't given the evidence biographically, which is... Let me give you one example very quickly. I should be 1 minute. Time me. It's a challenge. Now, that means then I speak too quickly, because he complains that I'm trying to say so much so quickly that with my Cockney accent speaking quickly, no one can understand me anyway. So there you are. But the last act that we know Shakespeare did before leaving London in 1612 was to buy the Blackfriars Gatehouse. The Blackfriars Gatehouse, as its name suggests, was the gatehouse. The Blackfriars, the Dominican house in London, there's still Blackfriars area now, Blackfriars Bridge, Blackfriars Tube Station. That was where the Dominicans were. That was destroyed by Henry VIII with all the other monasteries and convents and religious houses in England in the 1530s. The Blackfriars Gatehouse stayed in recusant Catholic hands from the 1530s, because you know by property deeds who purchased it, the 1530s till Shakespeare buys it 80 years later in 1612. It's also a known centre for recusant activity. There are government reports of priests being hidden there, and when the house is raided, secret passageways leading down to the River Thames so they can escape. There's other examples of a Jesuit priest being pursued, who's knocking frantically at the door, he's in disguise, to be let in. So this is a known centre for Catholic activity. This is the house that Shakespeare purchases, not to live in himself, because he's now retired, and he moves back to Stratford-upon-Avon. He buys it, and one thing we know, he stipulates that the current resident, John Robinson, should remain the resident. In other words, that the house should be used in exactly the same way as it has been being used. In the same year in which he insists that John Robinson should stay on as the tenant, John Robinson's brother enters the English College in Rome to study for the priesthood. John Robinson himself is the only one of Shakespeare's London friends who's present in Shakespeare's final illness and signs his will. So it's just one example. I could give many other court cases and other things of practical, real evidence of Shakespeare's Catholicism.
One more question, Gareth.
So just quickly, my understanding is that Nietzsche accused Christianity of destroying Eros. And what I'm wondering is, it seems there's quite a move in the church, especially in the last century, to try and integrate God's love with Eros. And I'm thinking of, for example, Graham Greene's The End of the Affair, and things like that. But do we see in the literary tradition of the church that same effort, or even that same synthesis happening naturally?
Okay, I think, if I might as well end on a subject of controversy here, that it's a false dichotomy. That ultimately the true love and the other love is basically a homo viator, man on a journey, man on a pilgrimage, man who lays down his life self-sacrificially to grow in virtue to get to heaven. That's the life of homo viator, that's the life of true love, self-sacrificial love throughout life, choosing virtue. Against that is our own alter ego, homo superbus, proud man who refuses to be homo viator, who wants to do his own thing. So false love is laying down the life of the beloved for the self. That's an act of pride, not an act of eros. So, for instance, Regan and Goneril in King Lear are betraying their father's love. It's not erotic love they're betraying. So eros, like all of the accidental aspects of love, in other words, the feelings attached to it. So I said the essence of love is freely choosing to give ourselves to the beloved. If you're not doing that, if you're behaving selfishly, you're not loving them, irrespective of whatever feeling you might have towards them, okay? So, but these various feelings and facets, accidental aspects of what is associated with love includes eros. And of course, it's absolutely appropriate that there should be erotic feelings between spouses. In fact, it's probably problematic if there isn't, right? That there's that we see that manifest in the church. Great doctors of the church, like St. John of the Cross, read his poetry. Look at that wonderful statue of St. Teresa of Avila in ecstasy. That the church has always been comfortable with eros. It's a Freudian. You mentioned Nietzsche; he's another problem. But you know, it's a Freudian misunderstanding that somehow, if you don't believe indulging sexual desire is a good thing, therefore you got hang-ups, right? The church has no hang-ups about eros, but it does believe that eros has to be controlled by reason, which means virtue, which means chastity. So, you know, even eros has to be subject to chastity.
Let us thank Joseph again for a wonderful presentation.